My name is Marlowe. Philip Marlowe. Occupation? Private eye. You know, someone says, follow that guy, so I follow him. What do I get for that? $10 a day plus expenses. If you think that buys a lot of fancy groceries, believe me, brother, you're wrong. Right now, on Warner Archive DVD and other movie services, you might have heard of a little Christmas present. A little story called The Mystery of the Lady in the Lake. Only one man knows the secret lady in the lake, and that's me. This is the story through my eyes. You solve the mystery. You find the clues. And remember, you gotta watch them all the time. And subscribe to this channel. Hello friends, and happy December! It's snowing like crazy out there, so I would say today's a good day to stay in and watch a few classic Christmas films. Last year I did some Christmas videos of my favorite shows and movies available on VHS and DVD, perfect for watching every holiday, but this year I thought let's change things up. Let's look at some gritty crime dramas and film noir classics, and a few kind of forgotten gems that all take place during the festive Yuletide season. And what better way to kick things off than with 1947's Lady in the Lake. Lady in the Lake, of course, is based on one of the Philip Marlowe detective novels by popular writer of pulp and detective fiction Raymond Chandler. The most famous book of his, of course, the top one there, The Big Sleep. But I must say, Lady in the Lake is my favorite of all his works. Here's another volume of his stories, his picture there up at the top. So many of Raymond Chandler's books were adapted into film. Indeed, Chandler himself was a screenwriter on several different movies. Many of the early adaptations of his work were switched from the Philip Marlowe detective character to a different detective, like Michael Shayne or the Falcon, that kind of thing. And really the first kind of true blue popular Philip Marlowe adaptation we see is 1944's Murder, My Sweet, sometimes known as Farewell, My Lovely, after the original book. Dick Powell, graduating from all those obnoxious 1930s musicals, does an amazing job as this ace private eye, a tough guy, a lone wolf, that kind of thing, always ready with a wisecrack, sometimes with a gun. Very good film, very underrated. I think today it's kind of been forgotten about, but the success in its day, and still a success. The most famous, though, of all the adaptations, 1946's The Big Sleep movie, probably the most famous movie that paired Bogey and Bacall. It was not the first, of course, but probably the one everybody remembers the most. Now, The Big Sleep, both the novel and the film, are extremely complicated stories with lots of characters, lots of plot points, lots of crazy stuff going on, and I think that the screenwriters for the Big Sleep movie soon realized that they couldn't turn this incredibly convoluted, bizarre murder mystery where not even Raymond Chandler himself could explain how certain characters were killed or who had killed them. And I think they all sat down and said, yeah, we can't make this into a direct, proper, accurate adaptation. So instead they kind of take it in all different directions and give Bogey and Bacall plenty of opportunities to do little comedy bits and have witty, somewhat sexual, but not really banter, and all kinds of wacky stuff. At the end of the day, The Big Sleep, I think, is so popular because it's such a quirky, offbeat, bizarre movie where the plot, as incredibly complex as it is, really doesn't matter in the end. Those screenwriters, of course, were very noteworthy people. One was Jules Furthman, who worked on tons of movies and was an expert in his field. Another, Nobel Prize-winning author William Faulkner, who had had a career as a screenwriter as well, though he's most famous for his books and short stories today. And the other, a woman that we've talked about on here before, actually we talked about her last Halloween, Lee Brackett. She'd written for The Vampire's Ghost. She was known for writing magazine stories that were science fiction or horror or detective based. Of course, when we talked about her last Halloween, we mentioned she's famous for her last film, which she worked on when she was dying of cancer, The Empire Strikes Back. She wrote kind of the outline for that. So all three of these authors, experts in their respective genres and areas, turn The Big Sleep into this really wacky, you know, mysterious, but yet not really like a whodunit thriller. and it's all the better for it. And The Big Sleep is remembered as a classic today, mostly just for how offbeat it is. I say this to contextualize the next Philip Marlowe adaptation, filmed in 1946 and released in very early 1947, The Lady in the Lake. Robert Montgomery desperately wanted to direct this, and indeed he did, in addition to being the star. But Lady in the Lake does something that's very, very unusual. Something that makes it different than any other film noir I can think of. And that is, we get the first-person perspective. You might see up there at the top, you are credited along with Robert Montgomery. If you wondered what the intro to this video was, it's a spoof of Robert Montgomery's prologue to the movie, which you can find very easily online, explaining to the audience that you are now Philip Marlowe, you are going to solve this mystery, so on and so forth. It's a very interesting idea. We don't see many movies even today that are told entirely, or in this case almost entirely, from a first-person perspective. Now this had been tinkered with in movies previously. The 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde uses it kind of to set up the story at the beginning. We're in Dr. Jekyll's head, his brain, whatever you want to call it, seeing various people he interacts with throughout the day to kind of get the exposition out of the way. The Sherlock Holmes movie A Study in Scarlet from 1933 uses it whenever the killer has to interact with another villain, but we don't know who the killer is yet, so we're kind of sitting in their perspective as they're interacting with other villains, that kind of thing. A very clever way to do it. Today, of course, we think of first-person viewpoint stuff when we think of slasher movies. You know, the victim looking around desperately and always sees a hand and a knife and then they get stabbed, that sort of thing. But Lady in the Lake does it for virtually the entire movie. The only exception, you know, whenever Robert Montgomery needs to come on and explain something, that kind of thing. Then we see him at his desk talking to us, much the same way I was copying him for the beginning of this video. But it's a very interesting idea, and we don't see many movies like that, especially not back then, but even nowadays, not a very common thing. So Lady in the Lake is most remembered for that, and it makes it stand out. And I have to say too, the cast sells it. You know, we don't actually see Robert Montgomery, he does voiceover, and sometimes when he looks in a mirror, we see his image, that kind of thing, but we don't, you know, we're inside his brain. And so all the actors and actresses have to talk directly to the camera, as I'm doing now. And they sell it. Audrey Totter and Leon Ames both do an excellent job. And you wouldn't even think in some cases that they were maybe uncomfortable or concerned how this would turn out. They do it very naturally and very fluidly. It works pretty well. The problem with Lady in the Lake is the plot and the structure. Now this is a really interesting concept, but it does get a little wearisome after a while. And the story doesn't do it any favors. Now, all of Philip Marlowe's stories, all of the novels by Raymond Chandler, are very intricate works, that kind of thing. They all have lots of years, all in motion, lots of characters, lots of things going on. Lady in the Lake is actually one of the simpler ones, I would say. But interestingly, here there are a lot of scenes that don't need to be there. A lot of things trying to force Audrey Totter's Miss Fromset together with Marlowe, a lot of her talking about like her career and how she wants to love a man, but she also wants a career and she can't decide, and all this kind of stuff, and there's way too many scenes of this, which sadly kind of undercuts some of the better bits. You know, we have a car chase done in first-person perspective, which is actually really interesting, but we don't get as much of that as we should. Instead, we get a lot of her kind of talking at the camera about her problems. Not good stuff there. I don't know, it feels like if they'd maybe kind of streamlined the story a little bit better, it would have worked. But interestingly, I don't know how much they could have streamlined the story, because part of the novel's appeal is Philip Marlowe gets out of seedy, you know, back alley Los Angeles and out into the country, to Little Fawn Lake up in the hills, so he gets to spend time with trees and rustic cabins and things like that, and kind of gives him a different atmosphere to play around in. The movie Lady in the Lake omits all of that, but it's mentioned in dialogue. It's really clunky because these are scenes that we should be seeing. Instead we just get, yes, I drove up there and talked to so-and-so and he said this. And it's like, really? You know, again, it's difficult with that first-person perspective, I think, to tell a complex story, but even in kind of a truncated form, it still could have maybe done with a little bit more kind of surgical removal of details or combining a couple characters, something like that. But overall, the cast tries to sell it. For the most part, it works. The highlight of the cast is actually Lloyd Nolan, a very familiar face in film noir. We'll be talking about him probably in next week's video when we get to the Lemon Drop Kid. But Lloyd Nolan as Psycho Cop Lieutenant Delgado. And you can't tell if he just likes to beat Philip Marlowe up or if he has more of a personal interest in the mysterious disappearance of a publisher's wife. Indeed, she is the titular Lady in the Lake, as we find out later. I won't give away too much for you, though. But he does a really good job. In the scenes where he slaps around Marlowe, they hit the camera and the camera actually moves accordingly, like you've just been slapped or struck. Very effective bits. Again, I wish we had more of that in place of the dialogue. And you know, some of that dialogue has to do kind of the heavy lifting because we have to be more restricted with what visuals we see. It's a very interesting concept and something that is mostly unique to Lady in the Lake. I will say another film that a lot of people compare it to, this one I only have in a collection sadly, is also from 1947. That's Dark Passage. You can see it down there at the bottom. Dark Passage begins in the first-person perspective, but then after the lead actor has plastic surgery and becomes Humphrey Bogart, then we see it from the third person. So it's only used for about the first maybe 50 minutes or so of the movie, something like that. This is, of course, almost the entire movie. The runtime, 103 minutes. So maybe a couple minutes of that are us watching Robert Montgomery kind of speak to us. The rest of it we're in his head the whole time. It's an interesting idea. It's also very unique in terms of soundtrack. When we think of film noir, you might think of, you know, some horns and some kind of, you know, sleazy 1940s music. But here, it's actually a wordless vocal. We get these oh, kind of transitions and stuff. It's really bizarre. And it kind of gives it a unique character. We get some like incidental Christmas music and stuff as well. Because weirdly enough, although the novel takes place in the summertime, somewhere along the line, someone decided it had to be a Christmas film. So very, very interesting. And I'm sure 40 years before Die Hard, movie buffs sat around the coffee shop or whatever and asked each other, is Lady in the Lake a Christmas movie? Who knows? But anyway, Lady in the Lake, a fun experiment, interesting movie, got some cool ideas, and kind of ahead of its time in a way. It feels almost like it could have been remade as an RPG for your computer or something like that, where someone would talk to Philip Marlowe, you have to click on a button and that'd be your option. I don't know. But interesting stuff. A good Christmas watch, I would say, for if you want something different and something that's very, very unique. Now let's talk a little bit more about Humphrey Bogart. When we think of 1940s comedy, we probably think of witty and urbane people getting into all sorts of wacky, over-the-top situations, or all the various World War II propaganda comedies that use the Nazis and the Japanese as the butt of the joke, that kind of thing. But we don't usually think of quirky, offbeat comedy with dark subject matter, that kind of thing. And that's why the few weird, gallows humor kind of 1940s comedies are still really popular today. Movies like Arsenic and Old Lace, and an import from the UK, Kind Hearts and Coronets. They are still very popular today because there was really nothing else like them in that particular decade. And this carried into the 50s. The 50s tried to push the envelope further, make films were a little more risque, a little more adult, but yet also be very conservative and in good taste and that kind of thing. And these two things often worked at loggerheads. And we kind of got some really weird movies at the time. Alfred Hitchcock's The Trouble with Harry is a good example of weird, dark comedy that can't make up its mind how dark it wants to be. There's Glenn Ford in The Gazebo, a comedy about a murder, that kind of thing. And Humphrey Bogart featured in a couple, one being the really unusual Beat the Devil, the other, our next subject for today, 1955's We're No Angels. Let's go with a crime comedy here to kind of counter the more serious first-person drama we just discussed. We're No Angels tells the story of three con men, played by Humphrey Bogart, Aldo Ray, and Peter Ustinov, who escape the jail on Devil's Island and end up becoming three wise men and helping a poor shopkeeper and his family find happiness at Christmas time. A very simple story. The highlight of it are our three leads, who have great chemistry. They are absolutely believable as friends and cellmates. They have great banter. You know, Bogey did quite a few comedies. Even The Big Sleep had comedy elements, as we mentioned. He handles those really well. He knew what he was doing there. Aldo Ray, of course, he popped up in all kinds of different movies there, as did Peter Ustinov. Both very versatile and both very good at comedy as well as drama. Ustinov, of course, would go on to later win 2 Oscars, but those were for more dramatic roles. Usually he was more along the comic relief line, but nonetheless, very, very interesting in that regard, and very well cast. And the supporting cast is quite good too. Leo G. Carroll, Joan Bennett, and of course the incomparable Basil Rathbone, Sherlock Holmes himself, as the villain, the arrogant André Chauchard, that kind of thing. So definitely simple story with a good cast, but it does have a little foible, and that is it's a plodding film. To me, it moves very slowly. It is a clumsy setup where our 3 leads go around the roof of the store and eavesdrop on everybody's problems, that kind of thing, and it's just so slow and clunky, doesn't work too well, and the ending is drawn out far more than it needs to be. But despite those foibles, despite kind of a slow, thudding pace, it manages to be really funny. There are a lot of gags, particularly those involving the snake. That is Aldo Ray's pet, named Adolf. Don't let him bite you. But some very funny bits there. Of course, Bogey gets all kinds of even just reaction shots and kind of mugging for the camera, that kind of thing. Now, We're No Angels is very much a dark comedy. Indeed, there are 2 murders in it, and both of them are played entirely for laughs, and both are actually pretty funny, that kind of thing. And of course, we have the discussion between the 3 convicts of when do they rip off the shopkeeper and his family, or when did they murder them, that sort of thing. But we know, of course, they're not actually going to murder them. Indeed, they're going to help them. The ending, too, I think is a bit frustrating, but although it does have a good visual effect, I will say I was hoping for something with a little more meat to it. But again, yeah, pretty fun. The story takes place, of course, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day on 1895 on Devil's Island there. And Basil Rathbone complains about being quarantined on his ship and decides to come ashore anyway, which sets up, of course, a conflict between him, Leo G. Carroll's shopkeeper, and our 3 leads here. A fun movie, again, not perfect, not the best Christmas comedy I can think of, but if you're looking for kind of a quirky, offbeat, pseudo-dark comedy, you could do a lot worse. So if you're a big fan of Bogey too, make sure to check out We're No Angels. Now let's go with something that is very risque and maybe a little more up-to-date. There have been many, many more adaptations of the Philip Marlowe mystery stories outside of the 1940s. Robert Mitchum played the detective a couple times. Liam Neeson starred in the recent film Marlowe, where he plays the character. James Garner had a turn. And one of the ones that isn't mentioned as much as it should be, because it's honestly one of the best movie adaptations there are of Raymond Chandler's work, from 1973, kind of a neo-noir, The Long Goodbye, featuring Elliott Gould as Philip Marlowe. Now, needless to say, this version, of course, takes place in the 70s, and it does add quite a bit to the Philip Marlowe novel, the Raymond Chandler novel, I guess I should say. But it adds quite a bit to it, and changes a few things up. But in the end, it's a really fun adaptation, and a pretty strong movie. And Elliott Gould is a very good actor, and he could play a lot of different types of parts. You know, I wouldn't expect to see him as Philip Marlowe, but he does a good job. But he gets a chance to play in a Christmas crime thriller that's kind of unlike any other. From 1978, The Silent Partner. In the 70s, Canada began offering tax breaks to film and TV companies looking to work there, and indeed, a film to take advantage of that policy and be praised for it was this very gritty, sort of neo-noir, but more like a heist thriller drama, and it has a few funny comedy bits too in it. But The Silent Partner is unlike either of the 2 films we've discussed today. So Elliott Gould works as a bank teller who realizes the bank is going to be robbed by the local mall Santa. You can see him on the cover there, played by none other than Christopher Plummer. That's right, Captain Von Trapp himself, cast as a psychotic villain who's also a master of disguise, who spends the bulk of the film toting a gun and threatening Gould's life and beating up women. He also was once the patriarch of the Von Trapp family. There you go. Of course, Christopher Plummer is great in anything. He was the voice of Charles Muntz in Up, so I guess there's another chance to see him as a villain. He did a great job in the mostly one-man show Barrymore, playing elderly John Barrymore. And of course he won his Oscar for playing the gay dad in Beginnings. But here, or Beginners, excuse me. But here, he is the villain through and through, and he is absolutely perfect in the role. He's threatening, he's menacing. He has a sense of humor, though, and he gets to wear several disguises and intricate costumes, including that Santa Claus suit that kind of precipitates the film. But as Santa goes to rob the bank, Elliott Gould, having anticipated the robbery, hides most of the money in the lunchbox that he keeps under his desk, and keeps it, claiming it was stolen by Plummer during the heist. But Plummer knows he's been ripped off. He knows the cops are looking for him, but he takes some time out to look for Elliott Gould as well. And although Gould manages to get him put away for a different crime for a short time behind bars, he knows as soon as he's out, he's going to come looking, and he's not exactly sure who he can trust on the outside, because as it turns out, Plummer's character, Harry Reichel, has a lot of connections, including a girlfriend who can't seem to decide if she'd prefer to stay with her psycho partner or maybe dump him for Elliott Gould and all that money, that kind of thing. So it's a really compelling film. You may notice Susanna York on the cover as well as Elliott Gould's co-worker at the bank, who he likes but can't seem to muster up the courage to actually start a relationship with. John Candy pops up as another co-worker at the bank. He gets most of like the funny kind of comic relief bits. He ends up marrying the hottest girl at the bank, even though she has eyes on several of his co-workers, that kind of thing, but he gets more of the broad comedy. I have to say, The Silent Partner is a great film. I remember reading reviews that Danny Peary wrote about how it was one of the best Canadian films ever made and kind of an underrated classic, that kind of thing, and he's right. This has a lot to offer. He said the biggest caveat is the violence, and we can't talk about The Silent Partner without talking about that. It's not so much gunplay, though there is some of that, but one of the murders involves broken glass slicing open a girl's neck. That's not a comfortable scene to watch. Feels more like something out of Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy. And there's also a scene where Christopher Plummer's character Harry beats up a prostitute, and very violently. And again, not a comfortable scene. I'm sure television versions edit that down quite a bit. You'd almost have to. And if that kind of violence and blood bothers you, then I would say probably skip The Silent Partner. But at the end of the day, if you can look past some of that and look at it as a really well-written kind of cat-and-mouse crime drama that happens to take place at Christmas time and feel very festive. Indeed, Plummer's first attempt to rob the bank is interrupted by a little boy asking him for various things for Christmas, that kind of thing. But some funny moments, some disturbing moments. All in all, though, a tight little crime thriller. Just like that Long Goodbye DVD I showed you. You may notice they are both Kino Lorber releases, so pretty darn impressive there. And as they look great, been restored, all that jazz. Pretty fun stuff. So I hope today, maybe at least one of these three films got you thinking of something different you could watch this Christmas. But if you don't like any of these, that's okay. Tune in next week, and we'll talk about a few more. Hope December's treating you well, and be safe, and we'll see you next time. So long.